Hey, what's up everyone? So you got to do an alternator on a Sonata. This is a 2009 2.4 liter engine. I'm going over this right now after the job, so I just want to tell you real quick what you're going to need. You're going to need some metric wrenches. You're going to need a 17 millimeter for the belt tensioner. You're going to need 14 millimeters for the two alternator bolts. You're going to need a 10 millimeter for your battery to disconnect it, and also you're going to need 10 to disconnect this little thing here, and you're going to need a 12 millimeter at the back of the alternator for this little ground post. And you're also going to need some vice grips or pliers and maybe a needle nose. You're going to use that to remove the hose off your radiator, which you see here. And you're also going to need, you're probably going to need a crowbar or some kind of metal thing, and ideally a heavy hammer to whack the alternator loose. And then just real quickly, you see I've taken the tire off. You don't need to do that. Some other guy said you do. I never used that. It's unusable on this vehicle. I'm not sure what his deal was, but there is no way to access any bolts from the tire area. So basically, to get this thing off, the first thing you're going to need to do is locate your tensioner pulley, which is down here. I'm going to zoom in. So you got your power steering pulley, you got an idler pulley, and then there's a third pulley after that, and that's going to be your tensioner. And you can barely make out, you can see three pulleys here. So there's this one here, there's this next one with the nut at the end of my finger, and then there's that third one down there. That's that 17 millimeter. You're going to turn that, and let me just change views here. You're going to go, as you're facing it, you're going to go counterclockwise. Ideally, you're going to use probably just two of these. You're going to use a 17 mil wrench box end on it, and you're going to do another one on here. You know, whatever, like this. Oops, sorry. To hold it. And what I did is I pulled it back to get it loose enough to take the serpentine belt off of one of these pulleys. Then you're going to wedge it on here so that it doesn't go way back, so that you have to like cinch it up or do anything weird. I don't know, basically it'll want to go down a lot farther, so you don't really want that to happen. But you also got to be aware of wrenches flying off or breaking stuff. You know, with this plastic being old, you don't want to do that. So basically, with the belt off, you're going to loosen these bolts that hold the old alternator on. You can probably just take them out all the way. To get the top one out, you're going to end up having to go underneath this hose that my finger's on for your AC. You're going to have to pull this up a little bit, and that's going to come out. The lower one is going to come out. You're going to feel around for it, for that bolt to get it out. The orientation of the alternator is the way I have this one set up. Pretty much exactly like this. Post is going to be at the bottom. You got a disconnect here. This disconnect you can do later on. This one you do have to do before you get the alternator out, because it's a short cable going to it. So anyway, your other bolt, you'll have your spare alternators right almost exactly to the opposite side. You'll be able to feel it. To be honest with you, the only way I could get it out was using a breaker bar, because you do need a fair amount of leverage, at least I did. And then more importantly, it's a very tight space, so spacing from that bolt head is very important. So I used these black impact drivers from Harbor Freight. This breaker bar, also probably from Harbor Freight. It was the perfect distance. I did have to turn that socket once or twice on here until I found a good spot where I could really get it. Anyway, long story short, you're going to take those bolts out, and then you're also going to remove the wire from the post of the alternator. Then after you remove the wire, you can leave the other connector on. This connector, it's easier to take off with the alternator facing you. What you're going to do is you're going to place a crowbar or some kind of metal thing right on the alternator, like maybe right on here. You're going to give it a couple whacks with a sledgehammer or something. Doesn't have to be real hard, but it needs to be hard enough to knock it loose. A little bit of WD-40 can also help on some of those joints. We're going to zoom in. Can also help on some of these joints. See, because these two parts of the alternator are pinched against this mount. That's part of the engine block, or anyway, it's part of the whole assembly there. So it's pinched on real tight. The metal is squeezed onto it. It's probably corroded. You're going to knock it loose. You're going to knock it a few times. and then you can kind of just jiggle it even by hand, maybe crew bar if you need to, but I did it by hand. It's going to jiggle loose down to here. Then you're going to turn it until that connector is facing up. You're going to use like a vice grips or something, and you're going to pinch that connector. And actually, is it the same style as this? I think it pretty much is. It's pretty similar to this, where you got an opposing side and you got this little side right here with my thumb. This is my thumb. You can squeeze that together and it'll go on there. This is disconnected from the AC unit because it was easier to get everything out with this disconnected. You know, all this stuff can be in the way. So I had to disconnect a few things. Here's another one I got to reconnect. Long story short, on this vehicle at least, I tried doing it without it, but you do need to remove your radiator hose. Easy. You got to remove this bracket assembly. Also easy, actually. You can hardly see it, but there's a little nut on the other side of this. See that tip of my finger? 10 millimeter. You're going to take that off. Actually, no, you don't even have to. You don't have to take that nut off. I did, but you don't have to. So you're actually going to use. I did take these two off. There's two 10 millimeter bolts right here at the tip of my finger, going on either side of this this little armature. There's some kind of vacuum actuator here, probably for pollution control. Take this whole thing off. Loosen this little rubber hose, and once you take these bolts off, you remove those 10 millimeter bolts, then this hose comes off. This whole little assembly can just be pushed downward out of the way, and you don't have to take off this side piece here. So with that out of the way, the alternator can be brought up through here. It is a tight fit. Anyway, once you get it out, you're going to be able to put your new alternator in. Shouldn't be too bad going in. One thing you're going to want to do maybe is use some Loctite on the bolts. Also, this could be a special circumstance, but I've never had this happen before unless bolt threads were slipping. So what I would recommend doing is check those 17 millimeter bolts that squeeze onto your alternator. Make sure it's the same thread size. I don't see why it wouldn't be, but when I tightened this on, and you can see the threads there, okay, so when I put my new one on, I suddenly heard like a bang sound, and then it was easier to tighten. That happened 2 or 3 times. Not sure why. It could have been this thing bending, or I don't know what was going on. Anyway, I heard it and I just kept going anyway. And it feels tight, feels good. At first, when this was mildly tight on here, this whole alternator was rocking. There's too much slop between these two arms that tighten on this piece. But after, you know, I heard the bang a few times, it did tighten and cinch on there. The belt, take some pictures or video before you take your serpentine belt off. You don't want to forget how that goes on, although it's like kind of self-explanatory, and the length is such that it's hard to put on wrong. So, but nonetheless, you want to be aware of that. Also, if you spray WD-40 around, best not to get on the belt or the pulleys. The petroleum products aren't really probably the best for the rubber. Another thing is I like to use some silicone grease or else brake lubricant on things like this. It's still silicone grease, the brake pad lubricant. Same thing. But anyway, I also put a little bit on in between these two. Wasn't necessary in my case, might be on some, but it helps things slide back together. But try not to get any on your bolt threads, because you don't want your bolts coming back out. And I think that's all I got for you. Make sure you disconnect the battery before you do the job, because you know you'll be working potentially, you know, near lines that are connected, you know, from your battery to this. You don't want to short anything out. And this bolt on the back here, now that I think about it, I don't even know if that's ground or if that's actually your main hot. It must be your main hot coming out. Regardless, I mean, because that's why it has a rubber boot on the back here. So basically, I would highly recommend before you even take that thing out, make sure your battery's disconnected. You don't want to short out on your tools or anything. And just take a look at this bracket. Don't disconnect these two. I put this on wrong at first. So just do the two 10s on the back of there to get that off. It's a doable job. You can probably do this in about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Good luck.